Okay, welcome everybody to the show. We have a great show for you today. My name is Craig Pasta Jardula. With me, of course, my co-host, Jeremy Kuzmarov, the professor himself. He's an author of many books. He also teaches at Tulsa Community College. You can see the book behind him, Warmonger by the Clinton. How you doing today, Professor?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Excellent. Listen, we got a lot of things to discuss because, I remember last election, we would talk about how the Democrats were so awful and that really we shouldn't allow them the opportunity to get back in. I don't think it necessarily meant, Professor, that we were going to go to the Republican Party. But now the Republicans are playing that side of the coin very hard, kind of coming out as the lesser of two evils. I mean, the Democrats are so awful. Kamala has got to be one of the worst candidates since Joe Biden. Joe Biden was one of the worst candidates of all time. He wasn't really chosen by the people, in my personal opinion. He was chosen by the establishment. They all got behind him, and eventually he, if you want to say won the election. I have a lot of questions about that election, but that's for a different show. What are your immediate thoughts, Professor, when you think about what's going on? And a lot of these people that are from the Kennedy party, you know what I'm saying? What they're saying, so once again, we're told that this is the most important election of our time, and not just by the Democrats who state democracy is on the ballot, but by Trump himself. Donald is claiming that we need to save America from Comrade Kamala and socialism. And yes, he really did say that. He couldn't stop saying it at his Wisconsin rally the other day. But the thing that's really driving me crazy is that there's a bunch of leftists, Professor, who are into this the lesser of two evils argument and repainting Donald Trump's short but crappy history. Most of these leftists came over on the RFK bus, which endorsed the former president, almost a month ago. And a lot of those supporters are the ones trying to rebrand Donald Trump as anti-war and then also justifying his xenophobic behavior and acting like he's a free speech warrior that's not going to let Israel call the shots. Let's examine this, Professor. Your initial thoughts before I show you a tweet from a friend of mine that is part of this whole rebranding effort.
Well, left on left, our purpose is to criticize the Democratic Party or liberal establishment or even more radical left from a point of view of people who want to adopt real left-wing policy that would entail, wealth redistribution, that would entail an end to the warfare state, an end to the surveillance state. So we're not in any way supporting the Republican Party. Personally, that their politics, I'm appalled by their politics. I've never supported the conservative philosophy of economy, which really benefits the 1%. Their model of government favors tax breaks for the rich, cuts in social services and social programs, deregulation, empowers large corporations. And historically, the Republican Party had been very hawkish, although if you go back to 1920, they were isolationists in line with their vision, more limited government. But I've never embraced that party or their philosophy. I subscribe to more left-wing viewpoint, and that's why I'm appalled at Democrats, because they've become really a second right-wing party, whether it's in domestic political economy and in foreign policy, as we've been discussed. At times they're even more hawkish than the Republicans. So I think the goal of our show is to develop a real independent left and maybe new party that would advocate for real left-wing policies, not to shift to the reactionary Republican Party, which we're against.
What do you say to somebody? We'll throw a monkey wrench in here before I bring up this tweet, because there's a lot of tweets like this out there. And like I said, this is a friend of mine who made this tweet, and I was going to respond to him, but I figured let's just do a whole show on it. What do you say to somebody, Professor, who's going to say, well, one of these two parties is going to win, and the lesser of two evils right now is the Republican Party? You just mentioned yourself that the Democratic Party has now become a party of the neocons, right? It's become a party of the war hawks. I mean, there's not one Democratic lawmaker who wants to abandon this proxy war in Ukraine. I mean, they keep saying all these childish, sophomoric phrases like Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union. What do you say to somebody who's, an RFK person who's bought into the unity ticket and says, well, this is the lesser of two evils and we do need to vote for the Republicans? Because I've always thought we're supposed to vote third party no matter what.
Well, it's not my job to tell people what to vote for, but I can advocate and tell them what's wrong with the Republican Party and that they're just using RFK. I mean, they're not going to adopt a peace platform. That's just an illusion.
Yeah.
If they're against war and empire and they think that voting for the GOP is going to advance that, it's totally an illusion. They're using RFK to get votes, but then at most they would appoint him to some token position. They would never give him any real power in the administration, and they're going to continue with an imperialistic foreign policy. They take a lot of money from the arms contractors, from the billionaire class, from Wall Street. And if you look at the kind of foreign policies Trump advanced when he was in power, he supported a massive, what was then record military budget that Biden has since expanded, but Trump's budget was approaching $1 trillion. He created the U.S. Space Force, militarizing outer space. He ramped up the drone war. He said we're there in Syria to steal their oil. And that wasn't an argument for removing.
Let's go into the tweet first, because we're getting ahead of ourselves, Professor. We have a format. I get to the way you say your basic bottom line. What you're saying is that it's not your job to tell them who to vote for, but you want to point out so they don't have these, what we used to call pipe dreams, right? Get off the crack pipe, as Dr. Cornel West would say. People don't have this disillusion of sorts that the Republicans are the better, right? You might say that they are the better, the lesser of two evils, but to say that they are a good party is ridiculous. Let's look at this tweet really quickly. I'm going to read this to you a little bit. We're going to break down some of the points. It's from Breaker of Sheeple, who is a friend of mine. I love this guy, but we disagree. And we're having an argument over Brett Weinstein, who I had called a Zionist, who is not pointed out what's going on in Gaza. I feel in that particular situation, if you are silent on what's happening in Gaza, you are complicit. But that's just my personal opinion, and a lot of people agree with me. But this is what he says: the two-party duopoly is deeply corrupt. But we also recognize, and maybe you disagree, that a Harris-Walz administration poses a uniquely existential threat to the country and the world. Every 4 years, it's the most important election of our lifetime, and every year, it's hyperbole. This time, it isn't. Team Blue has fully embraced medical tyranny, provokes nuclear war, explicitly defends the chemical castration of children, the implementation of CBDCs, initially sabotaged our borders, has no problem with late-term abortions, pledges to continue funding Israel without any preconditions, warmongers Iran and China, and openly seeks to decimate the First and Second Amendments. Supporters are blank libs, you know that word, neocons, establishment Democrat, Republicans, and endorsed by the likes of Dick Cheney. So let's break that down. Let's start with the first part, right? Is this the most important election of our lifetime, Professor?
Well, they say that every election. I mean, what I found in my study of U.S. politics is that there's a lot of continuity in policy, that really it's an oligarchy that controlled both parties. And I mean, there are differences between Democrat and Republicans, especially in domestic policy. But in the end, we're going to get the same kind of policies, whoever is elected. I mean, the president is largely a figurehead, and I can understand why a lot of people are off-put by Donald Trump personality, and they don't want that. But other than the off-putting nature of his personality, I don't know if life will be necessarily very different for any of us, whoever's elected. So on that ground, I don't see necessarily this election being any different from any other one. We have two bad
things have changed. Can we at least acknowledge that things have changed, that we had the COVID-19, the medical tyranny for some is a bridge too far. They've changed the way they look at us now. The spying powers of the state is very high. Can't we at least argue the fact that some people feel that this is a time of acceleration and the stakes are high in this particular election, even more than some? Can somebody make that argument, Professor?
Sure, they could make the argument. I mean, I agree with a lot of his critiques of the Democratic Party, maybe not all of them, but quite a few of them. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are living in a very perilous time. We're seeing great manipulation of public opinion, great corruption, great inequality, terrible wars being waged abroad. So it is certainly an important election. On certain issues, you don't have actually much different between the candidates, like Israel, Gaza. Both Trump and Harris will continue arming the Israeli. Although Trump will go all out gung-ho in his rhetoric, support of them. Harris may make like she's trying to broker a peace, but that's really disingenuous. Ukraine, Harris seems to be more hawkish. China, they're both anti-China, will ratchet up potential war with China, will sustain a gargantuan military budget.
Let's talk about that really quickly, because I don't want to jump ahead. We are jumping ahead, Professor. Let's talk about that. When we're talking about war, you're kind of pointing out the fact that there's this push that says Donald Trump is anti-war, right? Like we heard that. Literally ending all the wars. They're having a Rescue the Republic rally in D.C. in which they say want to end all wars, but the war in Gaza, they don't want to touch that one. You know, I would always point out the fact that he is a full-blown Zionist, and he also perpetuated the war in Yemen by heavily backing the Saudis, and he also vetoed, this is Donald Trump, a measure that would end the war. Give us another area you started going into that in which we clearly see that Donald Trump is an anti-war.
Well, Trump ramped up the drone war. He also supported regime change operations in Venezuela and other places in Latin America. He expanded drone bombing in Somalia. He murdered Omani Soleimani, the Iranian commander. He extended U.S. operations in the Middle East.
Yeah. So when you talk about the situation with Soleimani, how bad of a situation that is, that could have brought us to a war? Because a lot of people think, and they will state, well, Donald Trump didn't want to attack Iran. He rather just whacked Soleimani, and that was actually the better move. Any thoughts on that?
Well, that's an act of murder. Imagine an American military commander was simply murdered. That was obviously would inflame Iranian opinion, and that's an act of aggression / terrorism. And Trump also ratcheted up the U.S. Military presence in Africa and colonialist policies in Africa. So he's no progressive in any way, and he promotes this supramilitarism, veneration of U.S. soldiers that's reminiscent of a fascist culture, an extreme nationalism, and that's why people are weary that he resembles European fascists of the 1930s.
So there's another thing I want to bring up. Take a look at this, Professor. This is the same tweet from my good friend, Breaker of Sheeple, says, Team MAHAGA, which is Make America Healthy Again. And listen, I was all for RFK running, not the fact that I really thought he would win. And, you know, I should listen to him when he told me he was a full-blown Zionist. I'm the one who went up there and asked him that question in New Hampshire. And I'll never sell out my values ever again, especially not on the backs of the Palestinians. We didn't know October 7th was coming, but when it did come, he showed his true colors, and I think a lot of people walked away. However, the conversations that were coming about the FDA, Big Pharma, our skies, our water, our food, I really encourage those conversations from RFK. But you've mentioned yourself, Professor, in the beginning of this video, that he's not going to do anything. They're not going to let him do a thing. This says Team MAHAGA wants to end foreign conflict. We just kind of elaborated on that. Secure the border. He doesn't want to talk about any of the causes of our flow to the border. Reform our health agencies. Seeks to ban puberty blockers for kids. And here's the one thing I want to talk about. Reject CBDC in favor for Bitcoin. Professor, I don't want to say he hired. President Trump chose J.D. Vance, Palantir boy, as his vice president. With that being said, Professor, can you make the argument that Donald Trump might be the person who ushers in CBDCs when he brings in somebody like a J.D. Vance?
Well, from what we know, yeah, Vance is connected to Peter Thiel, who the founder of Palantir, which was founded by the funded by the CIA's venture capital firm, and a major client was the CIA. And yeah, I mean, they're really interested in turning everything, putting everything online, including digital currency. So this would be a key person for doing that. And he's a tool of big tech, Silicon Valley, and a surveillance state. And Palantir is a big war profiteer. They have major contracts for surveillance. They're doing intelligence and battlefield targeting in Ukraine. So it's Vance will continue to champion the warfare state and these dangerous AI, robotic warfare and AI surveillance. So he's very dangerous.
There's also a statement here too as well that I would like to show you, Professor, because I think we have to call this stuff out for what it is. And it's not that I am rooting against Donald Trump. I just kind of have the same feelings like you. I just don't trust him. And a lot of the policies from Joe Biden's administration were very similar to the policies of Donald Trump, especially when it came to foreign policy. I mean, the contracts that went through the Pentagon were some of the highest contracts of all time. Here's another part he says, and we have RFK and Tulsi Gabbard leading the transition team, selecting Trump's cabinet after he conceded his previous cabinet sucked. Donald Trump is also kind of ushering in not just J.D. Vance, but his own billionaires. I don't trust Elon Musk whatsoever. We see what he was doing when it came to Venezuela. Maybe 2 months ago, he couldn't find Venezuela on the map, but then he became anti-Venezuela. Maduro's a dictator, Maduro this, and pushing hard for that. We saw him meet with Netanyahu, but now Donald Trump has also been cozying up to Jayme Dimon from Wall Street, right? So now you have their set of billionaires, and they're trying to sell this argument, Professor, that their set of billionaires is better than the Democrats' set of billionaires. What are your thoughts when you see those comments out there about RFK and Tulsi picking Donald Trump's cabinet? I mean, I think you're delusional at this point. Go ahead, Professor.
Absolutely. Well, Trump did this before. If you follow the 2016 campaign, or he gave speeches suggesting he was an isolationist, I think it's really to hoodwink people who were, who wanted to end the warfare state into thinking that he was on their side. I mean, this is typical of what politicians do. And then at the end of the day, he appointed John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. And I mean, even during the campaign, he had Zalmay Khalilzad. He gave a more foreign policy speech 2016, and he had Zalmay Khalilzad introduce him. This is a neocon tied with the Bush-Cheney crowd, who were the ambassador to Afghanistan and a key champion of the war in Afghanistan. So he'd done that before, and I mean, he's just, he presents himself as an outsider who's going to drain the swamp, but that's just for show. He's a con man out for his own power, and he's in league, with the billionaire classes, and these are ruthless, predatory billionaires who will advance a public policy that further destroyed the social fabric of the United States. It was the Trump administration that passed laws to make it even easier for them to offshore their money so they don't have to pay any tax, and there's no money for so badly needed social programs for society, and that could help the poor. And I think Trump embodied the rule by the 1%. He epitomized that, and he's a disaster.
Yeah, it's crazy to me that a lot of people, they're still buying the same rhetoric that they bought before. And I want to point out now in closing, because we have about 5 minutes and change left, that Donald Trump is xenophobic as can be. He is hardcore xenophobic. Everything seems to be the fault of the immigrants, without talking about why there's so much migration here. Both parties avoid that conversation, so I'm not going to just single him out. But, this thought process that if you close the border and you deport all these people, first of all, if you deport, let's say 3 million illegal immigrants that you're talking about, how is that going to change the work market? Are now Americans going to go out and pick vegetables? Are Americans going to clean pools? Are Americans going to clean houses and be nannies? I mean, first off, give us your comment on that. And also, another question would say, even with this attitude towards the migrants that are coming here and his attitude towards communism and socialism, doesn't this open up the door for him to be worse than the Democrats as pertaining to intervention in Latin America? Go ahead, Professor.
But I think so, yeah. I mean, he feeds off an ignorant strata of the population. When he calls, Kamala Harris, Comrade Harris, he called Joe Biden a Trojan horse of socialism, which is absolutely ridiculous for anybody who knows anything about socialism. Biden was a front man for the banks and corporation in Delaware, who he insured, paid no tax to the state of Delaware. His policy were the exact opposite of what socialists would advocate for, as well as Harris. So, I mean, this guy is just a pure ignoramus, Trump. So it's an embarrassment for the United States to have him as a leader. And as far as the immigration issue, it's offensive. If you watch that convention, it's offensive. He insinuates that all Mexican migrants are criminals and rapists. And so just that. And I mean, yeah, it's a politics of scapegoating. It's turning people's attention away from the plutocracy, the people fueling the inequality and worsening living conditions and situation for middle and working class Americans is Wall Street and the elite classes. And he wants to turn it that the immigrants are somehow to blame for the problems in society, including crime. And that's a playbook of the fascists of the 30s. They blame the Jews. In the 1930s, the Nazis, there were serious economic problems in Germany, and they blamed the Jews and demonized Jewish people, and look where that led. So there's real fear about Trump, where he comes from, and I see that, and I think liberals are justified in fearing him.
So my final answer would be, when people also talk about the medical tyranny part, right? There's a lot of conversations out there that he is better on the COVID protocols, in which people have concerns from the medical freedom movement, right? However, this is the guy who ushered in Operation Warp Speed, and he turned away from his executive order of trying to get the hydroxychloroquine situation right. I mean, it was completely tanked. They threw it in the garbage, but somebody had gotten into his ear, must have gotten into his ear and said, listen, hey, this Operation Warp Speed is going to get you reelected. What do you say to people who say that Donald Trump isn't controlled by Big Pharma, even though he's going around with Woody Johnson and the Johnson & Johnson family at his rallies, and he's still bragging about ventilators? Professor, your thoughts?
Yeah, and we support the medical freedom movement, and Trump is not our ally. He sold out that movement. I mean, he would sell anybody out. He had no moral and no principle. You can look back at his career. He's just going to say what he has to do to get a vote. And I mean, a lot of politicians, he's not unique in that way among politicians. That's why they're so distrusted and hated. But he's a characteristic one, and he's no friend of the medical freedom movement. He'll sell it out. He's tied with Big Pharma, and he'll continue to do their bidding, as will the Democrats.
What do you say to somebody who says that we do have to vote for Walsh Harris to save democracy, though? I mean, this is an argument that they're playing. Listen, I think everybody wants to keep us caught in a two-party duopoly, but I want to make sure that we address the other side of the coin in this show today, because obviously we spent time as far as leftists trying to rewrite history when it comes to Donald Trump. And like I said, the tweet I showed is my friend, but we got a little bit over a minute left. What do you say to the other side of that coin, to people who say, well, no, because of Donald Trump and democracy, we have to save it. You got to vote for Harris Walsh. Close out the show with that.
Well, that's somewhat questionable argument, too, because the Democrats clearly showed that they do not support democracy. They did not even have a primary. So people who are more sympathetic to the ideology of the Democrats could select a candidate who they liked and who would advance their values. Harris was not voted in. They did away with the primary, and that showed their lack of commitment to democracy in that party. And we've seen that in the last two cycles. They cunningly, in a manipulative way, undermined Bernie Sanders, who was a popular candidate and would have been the likely victor without the manipulations of the DNC. And they've done that for years and years. If you go back to the 44 convention, the DNC hierarchy orchestrated a coup against Henry Wallace, who represented progressive values and would have avoided a Cold War and really invested taxpayer dollars in the American people and the economic development of the country. So they routinely hijack and sabotage democracy. So the parties show no commitment to democracy. So how could they save American democracy?
I don't know about that, Professor, but that seems like hyperbole to me. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode.